it'd be good to do a bit of a recap. I think, if I got it right, it's going to be a little while before we are back in Genesis with various things happening over the summer. And so most likely we'll have another recap next time. But so much has happened in the life of Jacob, and it's all starting to kind of come together. Now, we could start much earlier than this. We could start really in the womb when Jacob and Esau were fighting. I kind of have just by mentioning it now. But one of the big dramas in the lives of Jacob and his twin brother Esau was when Jacob stole the birthright from his brother. And then he stole a blessing from his brother, and then finding out that his brother wanted to kill him, he fled. And on the advice of his mum, he went to his uncle Laban. And when he came to Uncle Laban's house, he fell in love with, one of his cousins, Rachel. And was so smitten by her, he agreed with Laban, I will work for you 7 years if I can marry her. And he worked 7 years, and there was that lovely wedding at the end of those 7 years, and he wakes up the next morning after the wedding and realises he's married Leah instead. His uncle had tricked him. And, a week later, he does marry Rachel and works another 7 years in exchange for that. Well, as well as Leah, as well as Rachel, he ends up essentially marrying the two servants that are kind of come with them as a package deal, really. So he ends up with 4 wives, and at the point that we get to in the chapter, we read of at least 12 children who have been born in quite a short amount of time. So by the time we get to the end of the last passage, maybe at the beginning of this passage, a bit more time has elapsed, maybe another 3 years or so, or maybe even a bit more than that. But certainly where we were last week, those children had been born within the space of about 7 years. It's a lot of children. I mean, we said last time that you need those 4 wives to get 12 children in 7 years. 12 children, at least. That's 11 boys and 1 girl that we read about. Well, he's got to the end of the 14 years and he wants to return home, but Laban doesn't want him to go, and Jacob doesn't have anything. He's worked in exchange for living there and these 2 wives. He doesn't have possessions. There's no way that he can fund himself and his whole family to go on this great long journey back to where he came from, where his brother still is, where his parents had raised him. And so he agrees to continue to work for Laban, as we were looking at last time, and he makes a deal that he'll work for him if he can have all the spotted and speckled and striped and mottled and whatever, all the non-pure coloured sheep and goats. And it seems like a great deal for Laban until it starts happening, and suddenly Jacob really is blessed by God. And he suddenly becomes very wealthy at Uncle Laban's expense. And that's pretty much where we get up to at this point in time. And just to say, all the points and everything is up there because I had time enough to put that there. Didn't have time enough to get it all bit by bit, but I'm sure you won't be too unhappy by the surprise being spoiled. You can see everything that's coming up. You'll know roughly where we are as we go through. But as we come to this passage, and seeing this continuing story, the first big point that I want to emphasize is this faithfulness of God to Jacob. The faithfulness of God to Jacob, that's something that we see in this passage. And that faithfulness of God comes in contrast to the world and to everything that's happening around him. There are some lovely contrasts that we're going to try and bring out as we go through this. But God alone is truly faithful. And whatever faithfulness we know in this world, it is only a pale reflection of the true faithfulness of God, who is unchanging, who cannot break his word. God alone is truly, entirely faithful. But in these verses we see, firstly, that he is faithful in his promise. Verses 1 to 3, he's faithful in his promise. And in verse 3, we read, the Lord speaking to Jacob. Now, as this passage progresses, we learn that he's spoken to him in a dream and in different ways before. And we know back a few chapters, back in chapter 28, he appeared to him in a very profound dream. And here in verse 3, it does relate to that previous time where God had spoken to Jacob in the dream where Jacob saw the ladder. We know the Jacob's ladder, the angels going up and down and God speaking to him. Verse 3 says this, "Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you." Now remember, Jacob had wanted to go home before, but here is God commanding him to. And he is saying, return to the land and I will be with you. Now, I don't think that's God saying that he hasn't been with him already, but it's a promise that he will continue to be with him. Now, back in chapter 28, if you have a Bible, just flick back there, and we look at verse 14. In fact, let's look at verse 13 where God starts speaking to him. So he's seen this vision of the ladder, the angels going up and down, and behold, the Lord stood above it and said, verse 13 of 28, "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south, and in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Now, over the last weeks, we've seen some of this starting to be fulfilled already. You see, he's been promised offspring, and this man, in just 7 years, had gained 12 children. He's certainly receiving something of that promise of offspring. And him and his family have started to be a blessing to others, to Laban. We looked at that last week. But now, if you just look at verse 15 as well, God says, "Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." God has promised that he will take Jacob back to the land. And so back here in chapter 31, verse 3, when the Lord said to Jacob, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you," he is saying, remember that promise? I'm keeping it, and I want you to start in obedience to go back to the land. Because God is a God who's faithful to his promises. God keeps his promises. And that contrasts with the changing opinion of those around him in that land. Look at verse 1. We read that Jacob heard the sons of Laban were saying, "Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he's gained all his wealth." Now, these sons of Jacob, now his brothers-in-law, I guess if it means son in a literal sense there, we don't know that they've necessarily changed their opinion. They may have always been kind of unhappy with Jacob, but well, whatever their opinion was before, they're certainly against Jacob now in a new way. But verse 2 we read, "Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favour as before." Here we have an example of somebody whose opinion has changed, and for entirely selfish reasons. A contrast between the faithfulness, the unchanging faithfulness of God, and his uncle Laban, who's prone to change. And I think we can gain so much from just that simple lesson that when people fail, when people's opinion changes, when things seem to start turning against us, we can always know that God continues to be faithful. God continues to be faithful to us even when people around us fail us. Even when we ourselves fail us. Because let's face it, when Jacob had made many mistakes, I mean, he made quite a mess with that family of his, really. Got to that state where the wives were competing with each other, desperate to get the next child. Jacob, the head of the family, allowing that happening, maybe encouraging it to happen. Oh, Jacob wasn't always faithful, and nor are we. Oh, we mess up so much, don't we? Each one of us. We make so many mistakes, mistake after mistake. You know, I say this kind of thing quite often, but it's true that even in this last afternoon, each one of us has sinned to fully justify God sending us to hell forever and ever, if that sin hadn't been paid for. And this is not a mad confession of some great sin that everyone would tut at. I mean, the three main things that I've done this afternoon are be here for the meal, do some preparation for this, and watch the World Cup final. And yet I know I have not loved God with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind, with all my strength. I've failed God even in the space of this afternoon. All of us have. None of us have given us our all to Him. And Jacob was the same. He didn't give his all. He messed up. Just like, I mean, you know, I say this afternoon and those kind of... We mess up far more than just failing to love God and all that, don't we? We do mess up in ways that other people would certainly tut at. But even in those simple things, it is a massive, massive failure, and yet God is always faithful to us. Though we let Him down, He is faithful to us. God is faithful in His promise. But secondly, we see here that God is faithful in His protection. Verses 4 to 7, God is faithful in His protection. See, having been called by God to go, Jacob then explains this to his wives. So he gathers them together, verse 4. Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah into the field where his flock was. And then he goes on to start explaining what's going on. And it's noticeable in verse 6 that he does justify himself. He says, "You know that I have served your father with all my strength." He wants to know that he has given his all. He is not the guilty party here, and he's pretty much accurate on that. He has been faithfully serving Uncle Laban. Now, in the last few years, he's been knowingly doing something that has essentially enabled the flocks to come to him and away from his Uncle Laban, but only part of what they had already agreed among themselves. But again, we have a contrast between the treatment that Jacob receives from Laban and the treatment that he receives from God. Back in verse 5, we read, he said to them, his wives, "I see that your father does not regard me with the favour that he did before, but the God of my father has been with me." From Laban, he no longer receives favour. From God, he has continued to be with him. And in verse 7 we read, "Your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not permit him to harm me." Jacob's explained that Laban has been cheating him. Laban has been working against him. God has been protecting him. God has been working for him. You see, this does reflect reality, doesn't it? That so often people do work against us. Very often, there is no justice in how we are treated. And we can stamp our foot if we like, if we don't like the way we're being treated, and I don't think it often does very much benefit to stamp our foot, but we can be unhappy, we can complain about it. It's a reality. Now, when we have opportunity to do something about it, we should fight for justice, of course. But the reality is that we will often be treated. And Jacob was treated far worse than he deserved by Laban, wasn't he? And that is our reality very often. But what a beautiful picture that we also see here, that he was treated better than he deserved by God. And praise God that that's our reality. That we've been treated better than we deserve by God. And that puts all the injustice into context, doesn't it? However badly we are treated by anyone around us, God treats us better than we deserve. And that really should have an effect of stopping us stamp our feet quite so much. Because there is always a net gain if we are treated better by God than we deserve. And so we see here that God is faithful in his protection, but we also see that God is faithful in his provision. Verses 8 to 13, God is faithful in his provision. And again, there's a contrast between Laban and God, because Laban gave him nothing, but God gave him everything. And in verses 8 to 12, we see this detail of how Laban tried to cheat Jacob. He kept changing the terms of the agreement. Well, according to Jacob, 10 times he did that. I mean, it's probably just a round number. It's probably him just saying loads of times. He was cheated by Laban. As Laban kept changing the goalposts, he kept moving what the deal was. And if he said, the spotter shall be your wages, and the flock bore spotted, because whilst Laban was trying to take away, God was giving. And if Laban said, the stripe shall be your wages, well, what happened? God blessed them and gave him stripe. That's the lambs that were born were reflecting the things that were agreed to be his wages, because God was bringing blessing. See, where Laban gave him nothing, God gave him everything. And his provision was for a purpose. God doesn't promise prosperity. He sometimes gives it, or certainly not material prosperity, I should say. He says sometimes bless people with it, but I think very often if he does, it's like with Jacob, for a very significant purpose. It is that it may be used for his glory, may be used for his purposes. And that's what it was happening here for Jacob. His goods are so that he's able to make this escape. His goods are so that he is able to make this journey with his 4 wives, with his 12 children, and now with lots of flock and all kinds of other things. God's provided so he can fulfill his promise and get Jacob home. Not only is it enabling his escape, though, it also shows something very important. It shows that God is the one providing. Because how has this provision come about? It's come through the miraculous. Whenever Laban says, you can only have the striped lambs that are born, and what comes along? Just striped ones. You can only have the spotted ones. What comes along? Just spotted ones. God is the one who provides. He's made it so abundantly clear. And so often throughout the history of the Bible, it's abundantly clear that when things are provided, they're provided by God. I think that's one of the reasons why often we find some of the significant characters in the Bible, the parents that have had significant difficulties conceiving. So that when the child comes along, they know this is from God. And there's so many other ways in the Bible and in history, in our lives maybe, where things seem impossible, God provides. And when faced with the trickery of Uncle Laban, I'm sure it would seem impossible for there to be a way that Jacob could get away. But God provides a way. And in verse 13, having provided this way, we read God saying, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. He's reminding him of that dream where he saw the ladder and he made those promises. And he says, now arise, go out of this land and return to the land of your kindred. He's provided a way and calls Jacob to follow. And in the same way, wherever he calls us to follow, he always provides the means. He always provides the way to do that. God never calls for the impossible. Whether that's our general call to obey Our general call to be holy. Our general call to reflect the righteousness of Jesus in our lives, in our day-to-day lives, in our decisions, in everything that we make, or whether that's a specific calling that He opens up us to. He has made a way. That way is provided, and we can follow with confidence that God is faithful in His provision. And so our first big title here this evening is the faithfulness of God to Jacob, and what we see true here of Jacob is true for us. God is faithful where the world fails. God is faithful. But our second big title is the response of the family. The response of the family. The big question is, how will everyone in this family, all together, the 4 wives, particularly the main 2, and all the children, how's everyone going to respond to the call of this faithful God? And first of all, we see the wives decide their allegiance. Verses 14 to 16, the wives decide their allegiance. And they have a choice here. Jacob calls them to this field, and he tries to sell his case as well as he can. Verse 6, that's I think why he's trying to be so persuasive. You know that I have served your father with all my strength. He's trying to win their affection. He's trying to help them to see that he's the good guy in all of this. Because they have a choice. And the choice is not an easy choice to make. They either are to honour their father and dishonour their husband, or they are to honour their husband and dishonour their father. Well, they align with Jacob. They choose to honour their husband and not their father, and yet the reasons do not seem all that wholesome. They do not seem entirely positive. Verse 14, Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, "Is there any portion of inheritance left to us in our father's house?" In other words, is there anything that ties us here? It's a hypothetical question because there's not. Verse 15, are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. There's a certain amount of power that Laban has had over his daughters as he has had over Jacob, but whether it's a recent revelation or long, long ago, they've seen what Laban's really like and seen how they were used as pawns in order to get Jacob to work for those 14 years. Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he indeed has devoured our money. That's money that they should have or be passed on as a dowry. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do. Now that last comment there is the nearest they get to an acknowledgement of God, but it seems their biggest reason for aligning with Jacob is that they have a bit of an issue with their father. And it particularly ties in with the money. I mean, he's taken all our money. And now you've got all our money, so we better stick with you. Now, that may sound a very cynical thing. I think that's the flavour that we're meant to get out of this. And this at the end of verse 16, this acknowledgement of God that, well, whatever God has said to you, do. They don't seem to be personally interested in what God has said to Jacob. They don't seem to have a personal interest in God at all. And you wonder whether Jacob just seemed to have missed a wonderful opportunity. All these years that he's spending with his wives, all these years where they've been fighting about who's going to have the next child, years in which they have seemed to have some acknowledgement of God, and yet the reason they're going to stick with Jacob seems to be more about the money than about Jacob's God. And if you contrast that with the attitude of Ruth in the book of Ruth, when Ruth has a chance to stay in her homeland and not stay with her mother-in-law, having lost her husband, the son of Naomi. But we read there that Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." See, that's powerful stuff, isn't it? Your God will be my God. And that's what I want to hear from Rachel and Leah here. Maybe they're a little bit the way there, but maybe not entirely. And the fact that they're not entirely there will lead to a problem that we'll come back to in just a few minutes. But I think what we see here is that these wives of Jacob, largely speaking, are responding to the faithfulness of God in the right way, but not exactly for the right reason. And I think we can be guilty of that very easily, both in small ways but also in big ways. We can very easily be swayed and persuaded and follow certain ways because of reasons other than a real response to God. I mean, it's so easy to sing along to songs of worship and praise when we have none of that feeling in our hearts. Oh, don't get me wrong, the encouragement of the other people that we're with singing and praising God is so important and vital to sometimes get us into that right place. But we can have a sour heart and sing with a big smile on our face. Or just to be here. Just to be here this evening. We could be here for all the right reasons, and we could be here for not the right reasons. You see, it is a problem that people, whether old or young, can be tempted to not follow God because they don't want to be different to their friends. You see, they don't want to come, do the things that relate to following Christ because, well, that's just not the thing that's done. But equally problematic is the other way around, where we do those things because of the influence of our friends and family, and not much more than that. Now, if we're talking about being here this evening as an example, well, it's better that we're here than we're not here. But can I encourage you to examine your motivation? What brings you here? If there is a mixed motive, if there's an element where it is to please man, not God, then the challenge is to change your motivation. The challenge isn't just to stop coming. The challenge is to change that reason, to make it the right reason. Let's make it our aim to be responding to the faithfulness of God in the right way for the right reasons. And not like these wives of Jacob who seem to be doing the right thing, but possibly for the wrong reasons. So the wives decide their allegiance, verse 14 to 16, and that then leads to the family who flee in obedience, verses 17 to 21. The family flee in obedience. And the key reason for fleeing is obedience to God. You see, it isn't that they are running away from a difficult situation. They're not thinking, we can't take this anymore, we just need to get away. Because actually getting away is going to be more difficult than staying. You see, the pressure may have been building up. There may have been intense pressure on Jacob, but I think Jacob could have got round it. Going away would be a bigger challenge, not just because of the physical challenge of going from one place to a place a very long way away, a place that probably on the way had cost him a great deal of his health. But all kinds of other things accompanied it. I mean, for Jacob, returning home would have been daunting because he'd been having to meet his brother Esau again. His brother who was ready to kill him. As we progress in Genesis in future weeks, we'll see that he does definitely fear meeting Esau. For the wives, well, they were leaving their home for the first time ever. It must have been daunting for them, and yet they go, primarily in obedience, although maybe with mixed motives. And as these wives go out for their first time away from this area where they've grown up and they've lived their married lives so far, maybe the unknown that lay before them is why Rachel didn't fully trust in God. Let's look at verse 19. Laban had gone to shear his sheep. That presumably means he's quite a long way away. In fact, verse 22, where we haven't got to, indicates it's probably 3 days away or so. Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. Now, wait a minute. They're fleeing this whole area in obedience to God. But here is Rachel stealing some idols, some kind of handmade gods from her father. Why? Because she doesn't fully trust in God. She's holding on to something. So even though some people try to be a bit more sympathetic and suggest that, well, maybe she feels that her father would be able to divine through these gods where their presence is, so she's not doing it for herself, she's doing it to stop her father having access. Well, that's still not trusting in God, is it? I think probably far more likely is that she's holding on to themselves. Otherwise she'd probably just destroy them, wouldn't she? She wants to hold on to it. And we can hold on to all kinds of things ourselves, can't we? When we don't recognise the faithfulness of God. When we don't see how beautiful His faithfulness and how wonderful it is that we can trust in Him in everything. And you see, understanding that God is faithful is so significant because His faithfulness is beautiful. He is the God who never changes. He is the God who always keeps His word. And the faithfulness of God is so incredible that it is presented as a problem sometimes. Because it's so hard for us to get our heads around it. And I'm sure you've heard this kind of question, which without people realising it relates to the faithfulness of God. People ask the question, maybe to try and catch out Christians sometimes, well, how can a God be all-powerful and all-loving and allow suffering to exist? Have you heard those kind of questions? I'm not proposing that I'm going to give you a perfect answer right now, but the faithfulness of God is a question there, isn't it? God is all-powerful. God is all-loving. Well, one of those must not be right, because suffering continues. Either He's not all-powerful, or He's not all-loving. And yet the Bible tells us that He is faithful in all His ways. He is unchanging. He is truly always powerful. He is truly always loving. He is also truly always just. And the reason why there is suffering at all in the world is because of the sin that is in the world. That doesn't mean all suffering relates directly to a sin. But if there was never any sin in the world, there'd be no death. There'd be no suffering. But God is completely faithful to His justice. And every sin will be punished. And yet He's also entirely faithful to His love. And that's how He provides a way of us being rescued. Through Jesus coming and bearing the punishment for our sins so that every sin is punished. And His power is displayed on the cross as His love and His justice is shown in complete faithfulness. The faithfulness of God is shown in the cross, and it's beautiful, isn't it? If how that all works is a bit confusing, we can talk about that afterwards, but I don't want to go too much in it. But the faithfulness of God is staggeringly beautiful. And when we recognise that faithfulness, we realise we really can trust Him for everything. We don't need to hang on to things in this world. We don't need to hang on to those things that give us our own kind of comfort, our own assurance, our own joy, our own entertainment. We don't need to keep turning to the things that God has shown us we don't need. Because what we need is God. And He is faithful and will provide. Let us respond to God with real joy. And when we see the response of the family, that the wives, they respond in the right way, but perhaps for the wrong reason. Jacob, to his credit, seems to be following for the right reason. And verse 20, we read in the ESV, it says, Jacob tricked Laban, the Aramean. In the footnote, it says, Jacob stole the heart of Laban. I like that expression. It doesn't mean a negative trick. It means he did it without Laban knowing. I mean, you can't really flee very easily if you first tell them that you're fleeing. Verse 21, he fled with all he had and arose and crossed the Euphrates and set his face towards the hill country of Gilead. This is where he's going. He set his face. Let us show our faithfulness and set our faith in the place that we're going, our face towards where we're going. Ultimately, this glory. And we were looking at that this morning. Setting our hearts, setting our minds on the things above. That is our hope. Let us set our face towards there and walk towards it with great joy. Joy at the fact that we serve and follow a God who is faithful. Let's pray. Father God, thank you that you are a faithful God, and we can entirely, fully trust in you. Oh Lord, we are sorry for the ways that we so easily don't. So easily we fail to trust. Oh, but you are good. And even when we fail you, you are still faithful to us. So help us to follow. Help us to set our face towards eternity and seek your ways in everything we do for your glory. Amen.